All right, this is lecture 3 for human physiology. Now, as I told you, in order to understand the physiology and regulation of physiological systems in the body, you really have to understand some of the basic neurophysiology or neurophysiological control mechanisms that are operating. As I said, the nervous system generally works on the basis of receiving sensory input. And those are signals that come from inside or outside of the body. Signals coming in from outside of the body would be light, which is picked up by the photoreceptors in your eyes, or sound, which is picked up by specialized cells that respond to sound waves in your inner ear, or middle ear, and then into the inner ear. So you have all kinds of sensory stimuli coming from outside your body, but you also have sensory stimuli originating inside your body, which are picked up also by specialized neural sensory tissue. So, for example, in the heart, in terms of the cardiovascular system, rather, you have sensory tissue that can detect blood pressure. It's located in the aortic body. In the wall of the aorta, you have baroreceptors. This is sensory tissue that's responsive to pressure. You also have baroreceptors in the carotid bodies, located in the carotid arteries on the right and left side of your neck. In this way, the blood pressure to the systemic overall circulation through the body, which originates certainly in the heart but gets pumped out through the aorta, that blood pressure can be monitored by virtue of the sensory tissue in the aortic body, baroreceptor tissue in the aortic body. And also blood pressure going up to your brain, which is, after all, the most sensitive organ to changes in blood pressure, are also detected. Blood pressure changes are detected by the baroreceptors in the left and right carotid bodies and the left and right carotid arteries. Those kind of measurements, constant monitoring of your status and of any stimuli that are coming in, are all done by all kinds of different specialized sensory neurons. You have sensory neurons that respond to pressure or heat or pain or stretching. You have those are internal ones, all kinds of different ones. You have pH, PCO2, PO2, etc. You have other sensory tissue that's responsive to external signals, as I mentioned, light, pressure, temperature, sound, taste. All that sensory information is funneled back into the central nervous system, which is made up of your spinal cord and your brain. And in the central nervous system, it undergoes a certain amount of processing or integration. So the input is interpreted in the central nervous system. And it's the central nervous system that decides whether to trigger an outgoing signal. That outgoing signal is motor output, and it goes to effector tissue, effector organs, which include the different types of muscle you have in your body, and also glands. So we have sensory input, processing or integration of that information in the central nervous system, and then, if needed, motor output. And the motor output may be very quick in a reflex, for example, or it may be quite delayed after a tremendous amount of processing involving an exam, for example, where after having received a lot of input, sensory input, you process it, and then several weeks later you actually go and write the exam. So, that's a basic outline of our sensory, or our nervous system. The most simple, as I said, thing would be a reflex, which is usually controlled in the spinal cord. So you have sensory input coming in, and one or even immediate response to the motor output. In this case here, it's a little more complicated, but if we took the example of a pin being stuck into someone's finger, that sensory input would trigger a motor neuron to send a signal out to the muscle in the arm, the biceps, to immediately withdraw the arm. Well, neurons are classified broadly into sensory neurons, which transmit impulses towards the central nervous system, or motor neurons that carry impulses away from the central nervous system to effector tissues, or interneurons, which shuttle signals through different pathways within the central nervous system. So, as I said, the central nervous system is made up of both the brain and the spinal cord, acting as an integration, processing, and command center. And the peripheral nervous system includes paired nerves. Nerves are coming out and going into your brain and your spinal cord. The ones associated with the brain are cranial nerves, and the ones associated with the spine are spinal nerves, and they're paired because they come out in and out of either side of your body, left and right sides of your body. If this is your spinal cord, you also have up here for the brain, you have left and right cranial nerves. They carry messages back and forth between the body on the left and the right side, but you also have nerves coming from the spinal cord and brain going out to they're carried in and out. Okay. In terms of the peripheral nervous system, that's outside of the central nervous system, there are two major functional divisions. And I really mentioned this before, I just didn't put it in the context of the peripheral nervous system, but the two are the sensory division, which is these are afferent signals that send fiber. These are involved in sending afferent sensory signals into the central nervous system. And the second one is the motor division. These are efferent signals going out. The sensory division has two types of nerve fibers, sensory afferents. These are carrying impulses from the skin, the skeletal muscle, and the joints to the brain. And visceral afferents, these carry impulses from the visceral organs. Visceral organs are the organs within the main core of the body, in the thoracic cavity, lungs, heart, etc., or the abdominal cavity, all the organs in there. Their signals are transmitted in by visceral afferent fibers. The rest, skin, muscle, joints, are sensory afferents. In terms of output or efferent signals, that's carried out by the motor division. So they're sending out signals out through the peripheral nervous system from the CNS or central nervous system to effector organs. And as I told you before, the effector organs include muscle tissue, and there are three kinds of muscle tissue: skeletal, coronary muscle, coronary muscle, and skeletal, coronary, and skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle, and also to glands. Okay, so these are the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system is also divided further into two main parts. What you have is the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system of the motor division of the somatic nervous system controls tissues that are consciously controlled. So this is skeletal muscle. You consciously control your skeletal muscle. You are aware and you voluntarily control that muscle. The other main part of the motor division, remember the motor division are efferent signals going out to trigger responses in effector tissues. So you have the somatic motor division, or somatic nervous system rather, for conscious control of voluntary control of skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system regulates involuntary tissue. So that includes smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay. So here, up here, this is voluntary tissue controlled by the somatic output from the somatic nervous system. And below is involuntary tissue controlled by output efferent signals going out from the central nervous system through the autonomic nervous system. This is involuntary tissues receiving signals. Okay, and there are, of course, three involuntary tissues: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The autonomic nervous system has can be divided into two further divisions itself, and the distinction is very important: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system efferent signals are going out through motor neurons, innervating involuntary smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And they make adjustments to ensure an optimal level of activity, which is appropriate for the conditions there's an appropriate balance actually between the two divisions, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, so that you get a nice balanced control depending on what the input is. The input can change. You could be standing up and have a certain blood pressure, or lying down and have a lower need for a need for a much lower blood pressure when you lie down, because you don't have to generate as much pressure to get the blood to your head. So it can send out signals to slow down, for example, the heart rate. So it's constantly making adjustments. The autonomic nervous system is constantly making adjustments and appropriate to the level of activity the body is experiencing, and also the different variable stimuli that the body is experiencing. This is all subconsciously controlled. You are not aware of it. It's all involuntarily controlled tissue. Most of the effector tissue, or the effector organs, are actually visceral organs in the main core of the body. Remember, the viscera are major organs within the thoracic cavity, or the abdominal peritoneal cavity. The comparison between the autonomic nervous system that controls involuntary tissue and the somatic nervous system that controls voluntary tissue is the fact that the effectors that they regulate or control are different. The pathways, the nerve pathways that come out of the central nervous system are different, and the target organ responses are quite different. What you see here is the somatic nervous system. So this is somatic. We're looking at different nervous systems here. and we have the somatic, and we have the autonomic. And I remind you that the autonomic is divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The neurons that originate the signals all come out of the central nervous system, and they go out into the peripheral nervous system and then have some sort of effect on the effector organs. I'm going to review all of this, or go through most of this in the next few slides, but this is a quick overview. The somatic nervous system nerves that are made up of these extensions from neurons. So there's many neurons in the central nervous system, and these are motor neurons of the somatic nervous system, and they have a part of the cell sends out a long process that comes quite close to the end effector organ. In this case, remember, the somatic nervous system controls voluntary skeletal muscle. So that process that comes out goes all the way out to very near to the, in fact, right on it. It doesn't directly contact, but it's very, very close to the skeletal muscle. It is called, this process that goes out from the nerve cell is called an axon, and it releases a neurotransmitter, soluble neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and that directly affects and is always excitatory to the skeletal muscle. The architecture of the autonomic nervous system is quite different from the somatic nervous system. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, what you have is these two neuron pathways, both for the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. You have these two neuron pathways. You have a what's called a preganglionic neuron, and that is shown here and here. And this is also equivalent to a preganglionic neuron. And the difference is between sympathetic and parasympathetic is that the ganglion is where the post-ganglionic, or the second neurons, are located, at least the body, the cell body, not the processes that extend out, but the main cell bodies are of the second neuron in the chain are located in these round structures or collections called ganglia. So the preganglionic axons, send processes out to, which are part of the sympathetic division, send processes out to these ganglia, where you have the postganglionic axons, and release acetylcholine, which will activate the postganglionic axon to send a signal out through its axon here. These are postganglionic neurons, which will send signals out through their postganglionic axon and release a different neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. So it releases it close to the final effector organs, which are smooth muscle glands or cardiac muscle. There is a second, somewhat differently structured part of the sympathetic division involving a preganglionic neuron and then preganglionic axons going out down to the adrenal glands that are located on top of each of the two kidneys. And inside, they'll send their process into the inner part of the adrenal glands called the adrenal medulla and release the neurotransmitter again, acetylcholine. And that triggers release of two neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine, into the bloodstream. the adrenal glands are endocrine glands, so all endocrine glands release their product, which is hormones, different hormones, depending on the gland, into the bloodstream, and then that travels through the bloodstream and will act on, so that's a sort of a systemic effect. It'll act on smooth muscle, glands, and cardiac muscle. In this way, you have direct preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons forming a chain that comes close to the different involuntary organs affected by the autonomic nervous system. And you also have a preganglionic neurons acting on the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, in fact, if you look at the tissue under the microscope, histologically, it does look like neural tissue. Releases, when activated, will release neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. You could also call these hormones, but they're neurotransmitters also, and they act after they contact smooth muscle glands or cardiac muscle. Another term for epinephrine or norepinephrine is adrenaline or noradrenaline. In the United States, it's called adrenaline or noradrenaline. In England, it's called epinephrine or norepinephrine, and we use either one. I should point out to you that and consciously, actually, you're familiar with this kind of activation of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. If you are, this is called the fight or flight response. If you are nervous, if you're scared, if you suddenly have to act, you have to run suddenly because a car is coming, it's going to hit you. This is the part of the autonomic nervous system. It's this sympathetic division that gets activated, and you will have direct effects right onto the effector tissues, and you will have indirect effects through the release of epinephrine or adrenaline and noradrenaline from your adrenal medulla, which will act on these organs. Remember that all of these soluble neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, whatever, they will act on tissues that have the appropriate receptor. So we're talking about what's called, and you should by now be familiar with this term, but I'll write it down, ligand receptor interactions. The ligand is the soluble molecule, signal molecule, and it will act by binding to the specific receptor. But the receptor is very specific for a particular ligand. So cells will respond to adrenaline or noradrenaline if they have the appropriate receptor, if they can bind it via their receptor. Now, the other division that I haven't talked about but will now is the parasympathetic division, and this is activated when you're relaxed and involves the same kind of idea of a preganglionic neuron with preganglionic axons that extend out from the neurons in the central nervous system, and it extends its axons out to a ganglion. And inside the ganglion are postganglionic neurons that extend postganglionic axons out. The first neurotransmitter, again, is acetylcholine. In fact, it's always acetylcholine coming out of the first neuron. Always acetylcholine in each case. And the second postganglionic neurotransmitter coming from the postganglionic, at the ends of the postganglionic neurons, is also acetylcholine. So we have acetylcholine twice here and here in this parasympathetic chain. And again, it will act on organs that have a response to acetylcholine and have a different effect from the sympathetic division neurotransmitters. One key difference between the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division is that the preganglionic axons go to ganglia that are further away from the final effector tissue. In fact, these ganglia are present in a chain on either side of the spinal cord, whereas for the parasympathetic division, the ganglia is located close to the final effector tissue. So again, as I said, effectors of the somatic nervous system are voluntary skeletal muscle, and effectors of the autonomic nervous system are involuntary cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. The pathways are different between the sympathetic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. In the case of the sympathetic nervous system, these are axons of somatic motor neurons that extend their axons out from the central nervous system all the way down to the effector tissue, which is skeletal muscle. These axons, these long extensions from each individual motor neuron of the somatic nervous system, are bundled together into nerves. So you have a whole bunch of them coming out, thousands, hundreds, thousands coming out, and they're all together as a nerve. So they're bundled together under like a nerve sheath. They are typically said to be heavily myelinated. It has this sort of insulating material along the length of the axon, which allows for very rapid conduction of the impulse. In the autonomic nervous system, the axons form part of a two-neuron chain. You have preganglionic neuron and you have postganglionic. It's post here, it should be, or ganglionic is okay. Ganglionic neuron extending out a postganglionic axon to the effector organ. Somatic nervous system releases, all somatic motor neurons release acetylcholine. It is always excitatory in the somatic nervous system. Preganglionic fibers all release acetylcholine. Postganglionic release norepinephrine fibers if it's sympathetic division, or acetylcholine if it's parasympathetic, and the effect can be stimulatory or inhibitory depending upon the nature of the receptors on the tissue. So norepinephrine is not always stimulatory and acetylcholine inhibitory. Sometimes it's the reverse. The autonomic nervous system affects target organs by release of the neurotransmitter, and it's always dependent upon two things: the ligand or neurotransmitter that gets released, and the receptor type, or the type of receptor on the effector tissue. And so that's the structure of this system. Now remember, this is somatic nervous system controlling voluntary skeletal muscle, autonomic nervous system controlling involuntary tissue, including visceral organs, glands, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And there are two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic activation of the sympathetic nervous system occurs during extreme situations when the sensory input tells the person that there's something extreme going on, you have to act. And it'll have an effect on the appropriate, effect on the involuntary skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Parasympathetic performs or activates maintenance type of activities, conserving body energy and during a relaxed state. the two tend to counterbalance each other's activities. So you get a steady balance of each one controlling the other. And maybe depending upon if there's a change in the situation, then one will kick in more and then gradually come back down once it's corrected that situation. The parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is concerned with keeping body energy use low, controlling maintenance activities, including digestion, defecation, diuresis, which is release of water and the fluid in the kidneys. Its activity is illustrated typically. An example would be in a person after a meal. After a meal, the blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rates typically are relatively low. Gastrointestinal tract activity is high. More blood, in fact, is shunted towards the GI tract than to other tissues. Skin tends to be warm, pupils contracted. This is all kind of responses to eating. Sympathetic division, on the other hand, is the fight or flight system. High alert activities, exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment, whatever. It's quick responses. When quick responses are required, this is the division that kicks in and will promote adjustments during exercise. As soon as exercise is initiated, you get an increased blood flow to the visceral organs. You get an increased blood flow to the muscle tissue. The skeletal muscle tissue gets more blood flow into it. Now you may ask, why skeletal muscle? Why do I mention skeletal muscle when this is the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system that doesn't control skeletal muscle? But it does control blood flow into that skeletal muscle because there's smooth muscle around the arteries and arterioles that flow into the skeletal muscle. So that smooth muscle is under control. Smooth muscle around the blood vessels is under the control of the sympathetic division. And in the case of those blood vessels, because you want more blood flowing in the skeletal muscle, they will relax and you'll get vasodilation and increased blood flow in. On the other hand, blood flow to visceral organs, as I said, is reduced. So you have less blood flowing into these organs that are not required during, their activity isn't needed as much during a rapid response to some kind of emergency. Activity of the sympathetic nervous system is exemplified or illustrated by a person who's threatened. The heart rate will increase, the breathing rate will be rapid and deeper, the skin is cold because there is less blood flow to the skin, more blood is directed down towards internal structures like the skeletal muscle. Pupils will dilate, person starts to perspire. This diagram shows the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division are both two neuron chains. However, the ganglia in the case of the sympathetic nervous system, here you see preganglionic axons or neurons and their axons, the fibers. Going to the ganglia, there's a sympathetic ganglionic chain on one chain on either side of the spinal cord. All right, and then the postganglionic or the ganglionic neurons send out postganglionic fibers that innervate each of these different tissues. Okay, and they're going to innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. The only exception, of course, is the innervation of the adrenal gland directly with a preganglionic fiber from preganglionic neuron going directly into the adrenal medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland, where you have tissue that is neural in origin and can release the appropriate neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine. In contrast, for the parasympathetic system, you do have the preganglionic neurons in the central nervous system, but they send out longer preganglionic axons and fibers going to the ganglia. Ganglia is the plural, going to the ganglion or ganglia that are close to each of the end organs, and then a short postganglionic axons or fibers going out to the effector tissue that's controlled by the parasympathetic. So this is a different diagram showing the same idea, same kind of, but it also includes, I'm not sure if the previous one did, it also includes some of the cervical nerves, the nerves in the brain. Okay. So for sympathetic outflow, you have all kinds of signals that could come out, sympathetic division. It's what's appropriate for for that organ, whether the activity goes up or down. Sympathetic outflow to salivary glands. These are salivary glands. It is not activating; it's inhibiting. So when a person gets scared, their mouth goes dry. They stop producing or they stop releasing as much saliva. But the heart is activated. It will beat harder and strong and faster. So there are all kinds of different responses in the different tissues. As I told you, the output of the pathways, sympathetic pathways that go to the adrenal medulla, the preganglionic fiber goes straight into the adrenal medulla and you get direct stimulation, and then those cells secrete out norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream. So it's not an impulse going along a postganglionic axon and then release of the neurotransmitters. They're instead released directly from this organ, this part of the adrenals, and go into the bloodstream and travel through the blood to the organ. As I told you earlier, it's the nature of not only the ligand or soluble signal that's important, it's also the nature of the receptors is very important. Two major neuroreceptors of the autonomic nervous system include acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is, of course, released by all preganglionic axons. So the preganglionic axons of the sympathetic or parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system release it. And all parasympathetic postganglionic axons also release acetylcholine. So you remember for the parasympathetic, if the parasympathetic neuron, motor neurons in the central nervous system, it sends out the preganglionic neuron. It's a motor neuron of the parasympathetic division, sends out a preganglionic axon and goes to the ganglia and interacts with more neurons. These are ganglionic or postganglionic neurons sending postganglionic axons out, and in this case, both of them release acetylcholine. Okay, for the sympathetic, it's only the preganglionic. Acetylcholine releasing nerve fibers, which are bundles of axons, are called cholinergic, and the ones that release norepinephrine are called adrenergic. And again, whether it's stimulatory or inhibitory, whether it excites or inhibits the final target tissue, that is the neurotransmitter, all depends upon the receptor type that it interacts with on that tissue. The cholinergic receptors on tissues, there are two major types of receptors that can bind acetylcholine. They are called nicotinic and muscarinic. They're named, it's a little, I don't know, it can be a little confusing, but they're named after drugs that happen to bind to these receptors and mimic the effects of the acetylcholine. Suffice it to say there are two types of receptors that can bind acetylcholine, and they're called nicotinic and muscarinic. The nicotinic receptors that can bind acetylcholine are found at motor end plates. That's the place where the somatic nervous system axons come into motor neuron axons, right? The ends come into contact with skeletal muscle. Okay. So that's somatic nervous system. In the autonomic nervous system, ganglionic neurons for the sympathetic and parasympathetic division will have, this is, the ones that send out the postganglionic fibers or axons, they'll have nicotinic receptors. Hormone-producing cells, in other words, epinephrine, norepinephrine-producing cells in the adrenal medulla will have nicotinic receptors. And that's always stimulatory effect. In terms of muscarinic receptors for acetylcholine, they occur on all effector tissues stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers. So in the end, if it's postganglionic fibers sending out acetylcholine, there will be muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and it can be either inhibitory or excitatory, again, depending on the receptor. I know it's not easy, but it's there. We talked about cholinergic receptors just now, nicotinic and muscarinic. Now let's talk about the adrenergic receptors. These are the receptors that respond to epinephrine or norepinephrine or epinephrine, also called noradrenaline or adrenaline. There are several different subtypes. The adrenergic receptors are either alpha and beta, and each has several subclasses, alpha 1, alpha 2, etc., beta 1, 2, 3. Alpha receptors, generally the effect of binding of norepinephrine to acetylcholine receptor is usually stimulatory in most cases. Binding to beta receptors is generally inhibitory. One notable exception would be binding of norepinephrine to the beta receptors of the heart, which is stimulatory. Okay. And we're going to use this when we talk, this information that we talk about parasympathetic versus sympathetic control of tissues by the autonomic nervous system. We're going to talk about that a lot when we look at cardiac function particularly, but also other tissues. Do the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system interact? Or are they always, it's either one or the other, and they're acting in different directions depending upon what tissue they're acting on? Well, in fact, for most visceral organs in the body, core of the body, the thoracic and abdominal cavities, most of these organs are in fact innervated by both types of fibers, both parasympathetic and sympathetic. So they're getting signals more from one or the other depending upon the situation, and they're responding to those signals. So both sympathetic and parasympathetic control of different organs by the that are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Typically, there's dual control, and it's a dynamic antagonism to precisely control activity to the appropriate level. One goes up and the other is down, or vice versa. For example, sympathetic fibers will, activation of those sympathetic fibers, outgoing signals from the autonomic nervous system along this, in this division, the sympathetic division, will cause an increase in heart rate and respiratory rate, which is not surprising. That's what you need when you have to run away from a truck that's about to crush you, right? You have to move. They will have an opposite effect, not an activating effect, but an inhibiting effect on digestion and elimination. So, you got to run away from the car. Now is not the time to have more digestive activity in the GI tract or release of feces in any way. Parasympathetic fibers, activation along parasympathetic pathways and autonomic nervous system will drop heart rate, drop respiratory rate, allow for digestion, discarding of waste. So the normal interaction between the two divisions is opposing, up and down. Sometimes, depending on the system, it'll increase activity. The sympathetic would increase activity, but for other tissues it causes a decrease, and vice versa. Sympathetic tone refers to sort of a low-grade output, constant output from the sympathetic division. That helps control your blood pressure. It helps to keep the blood vessels in a continued state of partial constriction. If your blood vessels at rest have a certain diameter like this, and they are partially constricted, then that means that they can vasoconstrict further or vasodilate. So they can, the smooth muscle can either contract if it gets activated and you have vasoconstriction, or relax further if you have, and so you get vasodilation. This idea of partial constriction is very important. You don't want to be fully relaxed, because then you can't relax more and let more blood flow, and you don't want to be fully contracted all the time, because then you can't, restrict further blood flow. So this is called tone, sort of a background level of activity. It's often also for blood vessels, it's called vasomotor tone. Vaso referring to vessels, and motor referring to the muscle tissue around the vessels, which is, of course, smooth muscle. If you get constriction of the blood vessel, then general constriction overall in the systemic circulation throughout your whole body, then that'll cause the blood pressure to rise. Remember, of course, V1P1 equals V2P2. Well, you have a certain volume of blood in you, and if that blood is going to be in a certain space, the space of your cardiovascular system, then if the space, because of generalized systemic vasoconstriction, if it gets reduced, then the pressure rises, right? If this changes, if the volume changes because of vasoconstriction, if it goes down, then the pressure will rise, because V1P1 equals V2P2. So you are, as I told you, you have sensory nerve receptors, specialized nerve receptors in the aortic body and in the carotid bodies of the aorta and the carotid arteries that monitor their baroreceptor, they respond to pressure, they monitor blood pressure. If the blood pressure is too high, you'll get signals coming out, autonomic nervous system, sympathetic division signals coming out for general relaxation of the smooth muscles. You get vasodilation and a drop in pressure. Or if the pressure is too low, you can get response, it's detected, and the response is to cause vasoconstriction and a rise in blood pressure. So they dilate, and the pressure needs to be decreased, and they'll constrict, and the pressure needs to rise. You also have a parasympathetic tone. It's the constant output. This kind of output helps to slow down the heart. Okay, so it dictates the normal level of activity of the heart at rest, and it also the normal level of activity of the digestive and urinary systems. And some drugs can block that and cause the heart rate to increase. It's an important factor to remember is that the sympathetic division typically can override any effects of the parasympathetic during stress. Even if you have a lot of parasympathetic stimulation going on, if there is the appropriate sensory input to activate trigger sympathetic division, the output of the sympathetic will override any effects of the parasympathetic. So no matter how, mellow and sleepy and barely awake you are, if there's suddenly a threat, your sympathetic division will be activated, and whatever output there is of the parasympathetic, it'll override it. Some organs require cooperative effects between the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And that kind of cooperative autonomic nervous system cooperation effect is best seen for in sexual reproduction with the external genitalia. What you have is that parasympathetic output along parasympathetic fibers will cause vasodilation, and that's responsible for increased blood flow to the penis and the clitoris, in the male and female. And so you get erection. And then with enough parasympathetic stimulation, I guess, you get a sudden activation, and it's sequential. So it's first parasympathetic and followed by sympathetic output. And that can trigger ejaculation or reflex peristalsis in the vagina, in other words, orgasm. So that is an example, one of the few examples of cooperative effects where one system acts sequential to the next in a sequence, and they have to cooperate with each other in order to reach the final stage. There are some tissues and functions that are uniquely under sympathetic division control. They are not subject to any parasympathetic influence. And they include activity of the adrenal medulla, which when activated by the sympathetic division will release adrenaline and noradrenaline into the bloodstream. But it's not under any parasympathetic control. Sympathetic control of the sweat glands, which will increase secretion. Sympathetic innervation of the erector pili muscle. This is a smooth muscle tissue that's attached to small hairs on our body, and it triggers the hair to rise. So in certain situations, you'll get the hair on the back of your neck rising up, right? Fear, startled, things like that. Kidneys under sympathetic control, and most blood vessels, not all, but most are under mainly, if not all, sympathetic control. It also controls thermoregulation, release of a molecule, important hormone molecule from the kidneys called renin, and has metabolic effects. All unique sympathetic division activity, controlled activity. In terms of thermoregulation, this kind of activity is because what happens in thermoregulation is that most of the regulation of body temperature is due to changes in the blood supply, the inflow of blood into the skin. If you're under too high a body temperature, then you will get more blood flow to your skin, and your skin radiates that heat off. Okay, so that kind of required dilation is a simple reflex. So applying heat to the skin in any area will cause dilation. It's a reflex dilation. So there's no it's completely an effect directly on the blood vessel smooth muscle to relax, and you get vasodilation. In fact, you'll get, with higher temperature, a widespread dilation of blood vessels through the skin, so that you get more warm blood flowing to the surface. That helps to activate sweat glands to secrete perspiration to help cool the body, and also helps you release heat to the air around you. If temperature falls and you're starting to get cold, you get blood vessels constricting. The blood is retained in the deeper vital organs, so you maintain the core body temperature. But there is no parasympathetic relaxation. I didn't know exactly where to put this in, but I think it's an important point that's not taught quite often, or and it doesn't have to do with any motor output, or any output to either somatic motor division or autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic. It has to do with sensory input. Now, most sensory input, to most people, they believe that they will feel that sensory input where it's occurring. However, for involuntary tissues and visceral organs, you don't feel the pain in the organ, like positioned in the organ itself. In fact, there's what's called referred pain. So pain stimuli that originate or arise in a visceral organ are typically perceived as somatic in origin. In other words, in the skin or the muscle or joints. And so, for example, if you have pain in the heart, if you have an area of your heart that's not receiving appropriate vascular supply, blood supply, and inappropriate too low amount of oxygen, that pain perception can be anywhere on the right side of your chest and down, the left side of your chest and then down the left arm, or also in the jaw, on either side of the jaw, the neck. That's quite common with something called That's quite common with something called angina pectoris. It's referred pain from the heart. Let me just change the color. Angina pectoris. That's an example of referred pain coming from the heart due to inadequate blood supply in some area of the heart, angina. So that's, often felt as shown in the diagram there, and along the jaws, either side of the jaw, angina pectoris. Another, there's many examples shown here. Another would be from the kidneys, for example, or the ureters. You can have pain in really a large area. You could have the ureters, you can get pain quite low down. The ureters, of course, the ureters are the tubes that carry urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. So they're located like that. But the pain quite often is much, and it can be severe pain during for example, a kidney stone attack. So, this is called referred pain. Pain coming from involuntary or visceral tissues and perceived as part of the somatic tissue, the rest of the body. Look, for example, here, pain coming from originating in the liver and being perceived here in this area. All of this is called referred pain. It's strange. Oh, there it is, referred pain. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture on the introductory lecture, giving you a background basics of the nervous system, particularly the output mechanisms that control effector tissues. So I talked quite a bit about the somatic nervous system that controls the somatic division, the skeletal muscle, and I talked about that which is voluntary, and I talked about the autonomic nervous system and its two divisions, sympathetic division, parasympathetic, which control involuntary effector organs like the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. All right, so that's the end of lecture 3.